Somewhere around midnight, you opened a financial app you didn't need to open. You weren't checking your money. You were checking yourself. You already knew the numbers, roughly. You'd checked them 4 days ago, maybe 5. Nothing meaningful had changed. The markets had been flat. Your income was the same. There was no news, no transaction, no reason. And yet, there you were, scrolling through the accounts, watching the total load at the bottom of the screen. And for a moment, just a moment, you felt fine. Not proud, not excited, fine. Like something that had been slightly out of alignment had been corrected. Like you'd confirmed something about yourself that needed confirming. Then you closed the app and tried to sleep. But here's what's worth sitting with. What exactly were you checking? Because it wasn't the money. You already knew the money. You were checking something else entirely. Something the number was standing in for. Something it has been quietly representing for longer than you've probably acknowledged. And if you're not entirely sure what that is, this video is going to land somewhere uncomfortable.
You are not careless with money. If anything, the opposite is true. You've spent real time thinking about your financial life, more than most people in your circle, more than the average person your age. You track things, you plan ahead. You understand the mechanics of building wealth not as abstract theory, but as something you've actually applied. You make considered decisions. You think in terms of years, not weeks. And you work. Not performatively, not for appearances, but genuinely, consistently, often harder than the situation strictly requires. You push because you believe in the relationship between effort and outcome. That belief has moved you forward. It has produced results that are real and earned. So, whatever we're about to look at together, it is not a criticism of your discipline. It's not a dismissal of the progress you've made. The progress is real. The effort behind it is real. But here's the thing about real progress. It doesn't always feel the way it should. At some point, you expected that as the numbers grew, something internal would settle. The low-level background tension, that persistent, hard-to-name financial unease would begin to ease. You'd feel not necessarily wealthy, but stable, grounded, enough. And perhaps there was a moment years ago when reaching a certain number produced something close to that feeling, a clean, uncomplicated sense of having arrived somewhere. But at some point, the relief stopped being clean. The number kept moving, and so did the feeling of what was sufficient. Enough became a horizon that retreated as you walked toward it. The gap between checking and rechecking grew shorter. The satisfaction of each milestone shrank. You told yourself it was just diligence, responsibility, staying on top of things. And maybe that was true once, but something has shifted, and somewhere, quietly, you already sense it. Here is what actually happened, and it happened so gradually that the shift was nearly invisible. At some point in your financial life, the number stopped being a tool. It became a mirror. Not a mirror for your finances, a mirror for you, for your adequacy, your value, your fundamental okayness as a human being. This sounds dramatic when you say it plainly, and that's precisely why it never gets said plainly. But pay attention to what actually happens in your body when the number goes up by a meaningful amount. Not the rational part of your mind that understands it's just a figure on a screen. The other part, the part that exhales, the part that feels briefly like something has been confirmed. And then notice what happens when it drops, when the market corrects and your net worth shrinks by a figure that is objectively temporary. You understand that it's temporary. You've read enough, thought enough to know that. But understanding and feeling are different things, and the feeling isn't neutral.
It feels like something is wrong with you. That gap, Between what you know and what you feel is where the trap lives. And it was assembled slowly over years from something that looked exactly like ambition and prudence. The betrayal isn't that you care about money. Caring about money is rational. Money matters. The betrayal is that at some point, caring about your money and caring about your own worth became the same operation. The balance became a proxy for a question that has nothing to do with finance. The question is, am I enough? Am I someone who's going to be okay? And the number became the answer. The problem, the quiet compounding problem, is that once a number is recruited to answer that question, no accumulation of it will ever make the question go away, because the question isn't financial, and the answer never really was. Here's the thing that nobody in the personal finance world will tell you directly. You can be doing everything right, saving aggressively, investing consistently, building real wealth, and still be completely controlled by money. Not because you don't have enough of it, but because you've handed it a job it was never designed to do. The job of telling you whether you're okay. And money is a terrible therapist. It has no memory. It doesn't know your history. It doesn't understand what you survived or what you've built or what it cost you. It just sits there as a number, a cold, context-free figure that goes up and down based on things that have nothing to do with your actual worth as a person. But you keep asking it the question anyway. And every time it answers, every time you check and feel that brief exhale of relief, you reinforce the belief that it is qualified to answer, that the number knows something about you that you don't already know yourself. It doesn't. It never did. And the worst part? You call that discipline.
Let's slow this down, because the mechanism that drives this is precise, and once you see it in detail, it becomes very hard to look past. It begins with a thought, usually one that sounds entirely reasonable on the surface. Something like, I need to make sure I'm building real, lasting security. Or, I've seen what happens when people don't take this seriously, and I refuse to end up there. Or simply, quietly, I should probably be further along by now. That thought produces a feeling. Not a dramatic feeling, not panic, something subtler, a low, steady pressure, a sense that the present moment is slightly insufficient, that there is ground to be made up, a gap between where you currently stand and where you are supposed to be. And then comes the behavior. You check the number, you recalculate, you optimize something that didn't need optimizing. You do something, anything, that creates the sensation of forward movement. And here's what makes this loop so durable. It works. Temporarily, it works. The act of checking produces a microdose of control. The recalculating produces a small sense of agency. The number either confirms it's still there or it's slightly higher, and the pressure eases until the next thought arrives, which it does reliably. This is a closed loop. Thought produces feeling, feeling drives behavior, behavior provides brief relief, and the thought returns, because the feeling underneath was never actually addressed. It was only sedated, temporarily, by the behavior. What makes this loop nearly invisible, and what makes it so persistent, is that every single iteration of it looks productive from the outside. You're not avoiding your finances, you're not burying your head, you're researching, monitoring, reviewing, adjusting. The very behavior that the loop drives is the behavior that gets praised as financial seriousness. There is no alarm, no moment where someone pulls you aside and says this is becoming a problem, because it doesn't look like a problem. It looks like exactly what a responsible, forward-thinking adult is supposed to do. But the loop is not about the money. It was never about the money. It's about the feeling that sits underneath the thought, the quiet, persistent belief that your value as a person is not fixed, that it is a variable, that it can be tracked, and the figure on the screen is the most honest reading of it available. And a variable, by definition, can always move in the wrong direction, which means the checking never actually ends, because it was never designed to end. It was designed to soothe, and soothing is not the same as resolving. This is exactly the kind of mechanism that Smart Money Sabotage was built to examine, the moments when financially responsible behavior is actually a symptom of something running much deeper. Not to judge it, just to see it clearly.
Let me walk through what this looks like in ordinary life. Not in extreme cases, in the quiet, unremarkable moments that are easy to dismiss precisely because they feel so normal. There's the dinner table moment. Someone mentions, almost parenthetically, what their home is worth now, or a number they've hit, or a decision they made that paid off, and before you've consciously registered what they said, something shifts inside you. A fast, silent calculation runs. You compare, and for the next 20 minutes, some portion of your attention is occupied with an internal audit of your own position, not with the actual conversation happening in front of you. You are there, but not entirely present, because the number pulled you somewhere else. Or there's the Sunday afternoon version. You sit down to review your accounts, and you find that everything is genuinely fine. Not just okay, actually fine. But you spend the next hour restructuring things that didn't require restructuring, moving money between accounts in a way that changes nothing material, running projections for futures that haven't arrived. When you finally close the laptop, you feel productive, but also, strangely, not better. The pressure didn't lift, it just became quieter. There's the version of you that has gradually stopped being able to fully experience things you've paid for. A vacation, a dinner, an experience that was supposed to mean something, because the moment of spending is followed almost immediately by a mental calculation. The thing itself becomes secondary. The spending is what you feel, not what the spending was for. And there's the milestone version, which is perhaps the most quietly painful. A promotion comes through, a bonus arrives, a number you'd been building toward finally appears on the screen, and you feel something. Genuinely, you feel something for about 30 seconds, and then it converts. It becomes a new data point, a new baseline. The question shifts almost automatically from, I achieved this, to, but is it enough? The arrival never quite arrives. And then there is perhaps the most invisible version of all, the friend or the colleague or the sibling who earns less than you, but moves through their financial life with something you can only describe as unbothered. They don't appear to be running the calculations. They seem okay. And the feeling that produces in you is complicated. It isn't contempt. It isn't quite envy. It's something that contains traces of both, a low-frequency dissonance, a question that surfaces and then gets quickly suppressed. If they don't need the number to feel okay, and they seem okay, what exactly is the number providing for you?
None of this arrives as a crisis. That is the entire point. There is no single morning where everything breaks, no identifiable moment of rupture. There is instead a slow, almost imperceptible replacement, the kind of accumulation that only becomes visible when you finally step back far enough to see the shape of the past decade. The things that used to produce genuine satisfaction, work done well for its own sake, a weekend that felt spacious and unhurried, a conversation where you were actually present. These things don't stop happening, but they begin to feel, over time, slightly adjacent to the real measure of how things are going, slightly beside the point. The point has become the number, and everything else is either contributing to it or failing to. Over years, this creates a very specific kind of person, someone who, by all external measures, is doing everything right. Income is solid, savings rate is disciplined, investment decisions are thoughtful. The spreadsheet reflects years of serious effort. And yet the person living inside that spreadsheet experiences very little of what they were building toward. because the building became the destination, the tracking became the activity, and the number, which was supposed to be a means, became the end itself. There is a particular type of tiredness that accumulates from this. It isn't burnout in the clinical sense. It's quieter than that, a flatness, a sense that you've been moving towards something for a long time, and that the something keeps repositioning itself just ahead of you, not because you are failing, but because the goalpost was never about arriving. Because real security, internal security, the kind that doesn't require verification, doesn't live in a spreadsheet. It comes from somewhere else. And when you spend years outsourcing that need to a balance sheet, something atrophies. The internal capacity to feel settled quietly weakens, and then it requires larger and larger numbers to produce smaller and smaller doses of relief. And perhaps the deepest cost, the slow loss of the ability to feel genuinely good about yourself for reasons that have nothing to do with your balance sheet. The way the question of "how am I doing" becomes inseparable from the question of "what is the number?" That is not a financial problem. It never was, but it showed up in your finances first, and it has been hiding there ever since. Think about the last time you felt genuinely good about yourself, not your accounts, not your trajectory, not your plan, you as a person. Think about what produced that feeling, and think about how long it lasted before the number came back into view.
What follows are not questions, they're observations. Read them the way you'd read something written about someone else, with a little distance, a little curiosity. When your investment accounts drop by a meaningful percentage, the feeling you carry for the next several days is not purely financial. You have a number in your head right now, a specific figure that represents the threshold at which you will feel genuinely okay. You've had a number like this for years. It has changed as your net worth has grown. The feeling of okay has not yet arrived at the same pace. It is easier for you to talk about your financial goals than about your financial feelings. You are more comfortable running a projection than sitting with what the projection is actually trying to resolve. There are things you have purchased, experiences, objects, moments that you have never fully enjoyed, not because they were wrong choices, but because the act of spending them required an internal negotiation that left you subtly depleted before the thing even began. When someone close to you achieves something financially significant, your first internal response is not entirely uncomplicated. There is something underneath the surface reaction that you would prefer not to examine directly. You work harder than your financial situation strictly requires. Some part of you, if you're being honest, isn't entirely sure why. These aren't accusations, they're not diagnoses, they're descriptions. And if more than a few of them produced a particular quality of recognition, something that landed a little more precisely than you expected, that's not a coincidence. It's information, not about your finances, about what your finances have been quietly carrying on your behalf.
Here's what becomes available. Not as a solution, because this isn't that kind of video, but as a shift in how you see what's actually happening. Once you begin to recognize this pattern, you start to notice a distinction that was always there but was invisible. The distinction between a financial decision made from genuine strategy, from an actual assessment of what makes sense, and a financial decision made to soothe a feeling. From the outside, these two things can look identical. The spreadsheet doesn't record the internal weather behind each choice. But from the inside, if you're paying attention, they feel different. One comes from clarity, the other comes from pressure. You can begin to notice the moment when checking becomes something other than checking, when opening the app transitions from gathering information to seeking confirmation. Less about the data and more about the reassurance,
The moment it stops being financial review and becomes something that resembles emotional self-regulation. You might also begin to notice, and this is worth paying close attention to, the relationship between how you feel about yourself on a given day and how urgently you need to review your finances that day. Whether there is a pattern there that has nothing to do with what the market did, whether the urgency tracks something internal. This is not comfortable to watch in yourself. None of it is. But there is something almost clarifying about seeing it accurately, about recognizing that the restlessness you've been carrying, the persistent sense that things are not quite settled, is not a financial problem waiting for a financial solution, that no number, no milestone, no portfolio configuration will resolve something that began as a question about personal worth and was mistakenly handed to a spreadsheet for safekeeping. The spreadsheet was never equipped to hold it. And some quiet part of you has known that for a long time, probably longer than you've been willing to acknowledge.
At some point, the account stopped belonging to you, and you started belonging to it. Sit with that for a second before we close. There is nothing to do with this today. No action required, no restructuring, no journaling framework, no system to implement tonight. Just one small thing worth carrying with you. The next time you find yourself reaching for a financial app, not because something needs your attention, not because a decision is pending, but just to look, pause for 1 second before the number loads and ask yourself, honestly, what am I actually checking for right now? Not the answer you'd give if someone were watching, the real one. You don't have to say it out loud, you don't have to do anything with it. But the space between that question and an honest answer, that space is where the real work begins, not the financial work, the other kind. This has been Smart Money Sabotage. If something here felt familiar, that's not a coincidence, it's a starting point.